The Sumerian king list. It still puzzles historians after more than a century of research. The king list lists the kings of ancient Sumer living tens of thousands of years. Now we know before the Great Flood, the longevity of humans was extremely long. Now, why would the Sumerians combine so-called mythical rulers with actual historical rulers in one document? There must have been some truth to them. So why are there so many similarities with Genesis of the Old Bible? Why were ancient kings described as ruling for thousands of years? These are just some of the questions that still remain unanswered. This is by April Holloway from Ancient Origins. This is on Collective Spark Creative Commons. One of the many incredible artifacts that have been recovered from sites in Iraq, where flourishing Sumerian cities once stood. Few have been more intriguing than the Sumerian king list, an ancient manuscript originally recorded in the Sumerian language, listing kings of Sumer, which is today's ancient southern Iraq, from Sumerian and neighboring dynasties, their supposed reign lengths, and the location of official kingship. What makes this artifact so unique is the fact that the list blends apparently mythical pre-dynastic rulers with historical rulers who are known to have existed actually. So it's not mythical because the names of these rulers are recorded as being ancient rulers. The first fragment of this rare and unique text, a 4,000-year-old cuneiform tablet, was found in the early 1900s by German-American scholar Hermann Hilprecht at the site of ancient Nippur, and it was published in 1906. Kindly support my Patreon account since YouTube has again demonetized my YouTube channel. The daily posts are 5 videos daily, and they are totally different from what I have on my YouTube channel. Thank you so much for your support and that you find all my content so interesting. You'll find the Patreon account details in the description box below. And this is one of the cuneiform tablets listing the Sumerian kings and their longevity, their names, and of course the mask of an ancient king, what they would have looked like. Now, the fragment found in the early 1900s by scholar Hermann Hilprecht, published in 1906. Since Hilprecht's discovery, at least 18 other exemplars of the king lists have been found, most of them dating from the second half of the Isin dynasty, which was about 2017 to 1749 BC. So that was 2,500 years, or 4,000 years ago. No two of these documents are identical. However, there is enough common material in all versions of the list to make it clear that they are derived from a single ideal account of Sumerian history. Among all the examples of the Sumerian king list, the Weld Blundell prism in the Ashmolean Museum cuneiform collection in Oxford represents the most extensive version as well as the most complete copy of the king list. The 8-inch high prism contains 4 sides with 2 columns at each side, and it's believed that it originally had a wooden spindle going through its center so that it could be rotated and read on all 4 sides. It lists rulers from the antediluvian, that is before the deluge, before the Great Flood. So these rulers are before the Great Flood. These dynasties to the 14th ruler of the Isin dynasty, which was about 1763 to 1753 BC. That's over 4,000 years ago. The list is of immense value because it reflects very old traditions, while at the same time providing an important chronological framework relating to the different periods of kingship in Sumeria, and even demonstrates remarkable parallels to accounts in Genesis of the Old Testament, of the Holy Bible. The ancient civilization of Sumer, sometimes called Sumeria, is the site of the earliest known civilization located in the southernmost part of Mesopotamia between the rivers Tigris and Euphrates, in the area that later became known as Babylonia, and is now southern Iraq from around Baghdad to the Persian Gulf. Let's remember this is where the city of Ur was located, the city of the birth of Abraham, who later left to go to the area of Israel. Now, by the 3rd millennium BC, that's 5,000 years ago, Sumer was the site of at least 12 separate city-states: Kish, Erech, Ur is the city of Abraham, where he was born, Sipar, Shak, Larak, Nippur, Adab, Uma, Lagash, Bad Tiberia, and Larsa. Each of the 3 states comprised a walled city and its surrounding villages and land, and each worshipped its own deity, whose temple was the central structure of the city. Political power originally belonged to the citizens, but as rivalry between the various city-states increased, each adopted the institution of kingship. The Sumerian king list records the 8 kings reigning before the Great Flood. After the flood, known as the Noah's Flood, various city-states and their dynasties of kings temporarily gained power over the others. Sumer's mythical past. The Sumerian king list begins with the very origin of kingship, which is seen as a divine institution. Quote, the kingship had descended from heaven, end quote. The rulers in the earliest dynasties are represented as reigning fantastically long periods. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridug. In Eridug, Alulim became king. He ruled for 28,800 years. Al-Jar ruled for 36,000 years. So 2 kings, they ruled for 64,800 years. That's amazing. Some of the rulers mentioned in the early lists, such as Etana, Lugal Banda, and Gilgamesh, are mythical or legendary figures whose heroic feats are subjects of a series of Sumerian and Babylonian narrative compositions. The early list names 8 kings with a total of 241,200 years from the time when kingship descended from heaven, quote unquote, to the time when the flood, quote unquote, swept over the land, and once more the kingship was lowered from heaven after the flood. Interpretation of the long reigns of these kings. The amazingly long tenure of the early kings has provoked many attempts at interpretation. But let's remember, though, something happened which atmospherically and geologically changed our planet. Let's remember that before Noah came out of the ark, there was no such thing as a rainbow. Okay, I'm putting my comments in here. There was no rainbow. The rainbow only existed after God gave a promise to Abraham that he would no longer flood the earth with a catastrophe like that. And he gave him the rainbow so that every time the rainbow appeared, God would remember his covenant to the humans. Okay? So there was no rainbow before the flood. So obviously something happened with the type of light that the quote-unquote bodily star gave to our earth. The sunlight was different before and after the flood. So something happened to intensify the light of the star, the sun, and even the atmosphere. Something happened that changed the atmosphere and that allowed us to be able to see the rainbows that were created. Now, after the flood, kingship lowered from the heaven after the flood. The interpretation of the long reigns, the amazingly long tenure of the early kings provoked many attempts at interpretation. At one extreme is the complete dismissal of the astronomically large figures as completely artificial, and the view that they are unworthy of serious consideration. And at the other extreme, it is the belief that the numbers have a basis in reality, and that the early kings were indeed gods who were capable of living much longer than humans. Gods who perhaps descended from heavens, from somewhere from the skies. Let's remember that the ancient gods of Mount Olympus of ancient Greece were said to be extraterrestrials, perhaps even Atlanteans, that lived very, very long periods of time. Now, in between the two extremes is the hypothesis that the figures represent relative power, triumph, or importance. For example, in ancient Egypt, the phrase "he died aged 110" referred to someone who lived life to the full and who offered an important contribution to society. In that same way, the extremely long periods of reign of the early kings may represent how incredibly important they were perceived as being in the eyes of the people. This does not explain, however, why the periods of tenure later switched to realistic time periods. The same thing we see in the Old Testament. Before the flood, the people lived hundreds of years, and after the flood, they started living lesser periods of time. Now, related to this perspective is the belief that although the early kings are historically unattested, this does not preclude their possible correspondence with historical rulers who were later mythicized. Finally, some scholars have sought to explain the figures through a mathematical investigation and interpretation. Related to Genesis, some scholars, for example Wood in 2003, have drawn attention to the fact that there are remarkable similarities between the Sumerian king list and accounts in Genesis. For example, Genesis tells a story of the Great Flood and Noah's efforts to save all the species of animals on the earth from destruction. Likewise, in the Sumerian king list, there is discussion of a great deluge. The flood swept over the earth. The Sumerian king list provides a list of 8 kings, some versions have 10 kings, who reigned for long periods of time before the flood, ranging from 18,600 to 43,200 years. This is similar to Genesis 5, where the generations from creation to the flood are recorded. Interestingly, between Adam and Noah there are 8 generations, just as there are 8 kings between the beginning of kingship and the flood in the Sumerian king list. After the flood, the king list records kings who ruled for much shorter periods of time. Thus, the Sumerian king list not only documents a great flood early in man's history, but it also reflects the same pattern of decreasing longevity as found in the Holy Bible. Men had extremely long lifespans before the flood and much shorter lifespans following the flood. The Sumerian king list truly is a perplexing mystery. Why would the Sumerians combine mythical rulers with actual historical rulers in one document? Why are there so many similarities with Genesis? Why were ancient kings described as ruling for thousands of years? These are just some of the questions that still remain unanswered after more than a century of research. This was from Ancient Origins, published here under Creative Commons on Collective Spark. Please leave your comments, and thank you for your support.